The morning of June 15th, 1944. Somewhere between Cherbourg and Saint-Lô, a German Unteroffizier named Klaus Becker crouched in a muddy foxhole, counting his remaining rounds. 12 bullets. 12 bullets between him and whatever the Americans would throw at him next. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His company commander had told them to conserve ammunition, make every shot count. The resupply trucks, if they came at all, brought barely enough to sustain defensive operations. What Becker didn't know, what no German soldier could have imagined, was that across the Atlantic Ocean, American factories were producing ammunition at a rate so staggering it would have seemed like a work of fiction. While he counted his 12 rounds like precious gold, the United States was manufacturing 41,400 million rounds of small arms ammunition, not over decades, not over generations. In 4 years. This is the documented story of a mathematical impossibility that became historical fact, based on verified production records, prisoner testimonies, and government archives. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The numbers alone don't tell the story. 41.4 billion is not a number the human mind readily grasps, but consider this. In 1944, the world's population stood at approximately 2.3 billion people. American ammunition production that year alone could have provided nearly 10 rounds for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. The German military, fighting a total war for 6 years, expended an estimated 25 to 30 billion rounds across all theaters. America produced more than that, for small arms alone, in 4 years, while also feeding, clothing, and equipping not just its own forces, but substantial portions of British, Soviet, French, and Chinese armies. The disparity wasn't just about quantity. It was about a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy that German prisoners of war would witness firsthand when they arrived on American soil. To understand the shock German prisoners experienced, one must first understand what they'd been taught about America. Nazi propaganda had crafted a specific narrative. The United States was a nation, they were told, of lazy plutocrats and mongrel races, a society weakened by democracy, divided by capitalism, incapable of the unified purpose required for industrial warfare. German soldiers were assured that American industrial capacity, while large, was fundamentally unsuited to military production. This wasn't entirely fabrication. America had entered World War I late and unprepared. German military analysts studying that war concluded that American industrial potential required years to mobilize effectively. By the time America could bring its factories to bear, they reasoned, any future war would already be decided. They were catastrophically wrong. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that America had learned from World War I's mistakes. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the United States Army and Navy quietly studied the problems of industrial mobilization. They'd developed detailed plans for converting civilian factories to military production. They'd identified choke points in raw material supply. Most importantly, they'd preserved a robust, innovative private sector with enormous excess capacity. When war came, that preparation paid dividends that staggered even American planners. Consider the Lake City Army ammunition plant in Independence, Missouri. Ground broke in December 1940. The first .30 caliber round came off the production line on September 12, 1941, 9 months from empty fields to operational factory. Through a Midwestern winter, by 1944, Lake City alone was producing nearly 7 billion rounds per year. That's more than the entire German ammunition production for all of 1943. Lake City wasn't unique. It was part of a network of 12 major small arms ammunition plants constructed between 1940 and 1942. The Evansville Chrysler Arsenal in Indiana provides a particularly striking example. In mid-December 1941, Chrysler President K.T. Keller was asked if his company had an available factory. He mentioned a Plymouth assembly plant in Evansville. 1 week later, Army Ordnance increased the order to 7,500,000 rounds per day. Within 24 hours, they called again, 10 million rounds per day. Before the month ended, 12,500,000 rounds per day. Charles Jacobson, Chrysler vice president, expressed doubts. Keller's response was characteristically American. Charlie, in war you can't say no. If they want 12,500,000 rounds a day, we'll have to give it to them somehow. By June 30th, 1942, the first bullets produced at Evansville were test-fired. Before war's end, the facility produced 47 billion rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. This was the industrial reality that awaited German prisoners of war when they began arriving in the United States in large numbers following the North African campaign's conclusion in May 1943. The capture of Axis forces in Tunisia brought approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied hands. Many were veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who'd experienced ammunition scarcity firsthand. They'd fought battles where artillery batteries fell silent, not from casualties but from empty caissons, where infantry companies rationed rifle ammunition like water in the desert. The journey to America provided the first hints that something was different. German prisoners traveled not in cattle cars but in actual passenger accommodations aboard Liberty ships. These ships carried as many as 30,000 prisoners per month to ports in New York and Virginia. The prisoners received substantial meals during transport, regular meals, hot meals. Many German soldiers hadn't seen such portions since before the war. Upon arrival, prisoners were distributed to camps across the United States. By late 1943, over 371,000 German prisoners were held in more than 500 camps spanning 45 states. The camps themselves contradicted everything German prisoners expected. Barracks with individual bunks, mattresses, blankets, pillows, regular meals providing 2,400 to 2,800 calories per day, when German civilians were subsisting on under 1,500. Access to medical care, educational programs, religious services, recreational activities. One former prisoner, Hans Weicker, held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, later testified that life in the camp was a vast improvement over conditions he'd known in Germany. Another, Fritz Enslin, described Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We had the feeling of being in a Hilton hotel. But it was the work details that truly exposed German prisoners to the scale of American productive capacity. Prisoners were employed in agriculture, forestry, construction, and light manufacturing. They couldn't work on anything directly related to the war effort, but they could work on farms, in food processing plants, in timber operations. What struck them wasn't the work itself, it was the casual abundance, the machines. American farms operated with levels of mechanization that German agriculture couldn't match. Tractors, combines, mechanical harvesters were standard on even medium-sized American farms. The canteen system within prison camps provided another window. Prisoners could purchase items that had been unavailable in Germany for years. Chocolate, real coffee, cigarettes in varieties, soap, toothpaste, razor blades. The newspapers were particularly revealing. They contained criticism of government policies, debates about war conduct, frank discussions of military setbacks. They included advertisements for consumer goods that would be produced after the war. The advertisements depicted not a nation sacrificing everything for victory, but a nation confident enough to plan for peacetime, even while fighting a global war. The medical facilities represented perhaps the starkest contrast. Basic medical supplies, bandages, sutures, antiseptics were available in quantities German military medicine hadn't seen since before the war. Sulfur drugs, carefully rationed in German medicine, were used liberally. The introduction of penicillin by 1944 represented a therapeutic capability that German medicine completely lacked, but it was conversations with American guards and local civilians that truly conveyed the scale of ammunition production. Americans talked openly about their work. Guards mentioned relatives working at ammunition plants. Local newspapers contained articles about production milestones. Lake City ammunition plant employed 21,000 workers at its wartime peak, producing 4 million rounds per day. And Lake City was one of 12 major facilities. The mathematics became unavoidable. If Lake City alone produced 7 billion rounds in 1944, and it was one of 12 major facilities, the numbers reached levels German prisoners initially refused to believe. 41.4 billion rounds seemed like obvious propaganda, except the evidence surrounded them: the food they ate, the equipment on farms, the consumer goods in stores, the casual confidence of Americans discussing not whether the war would be won, but how quickly. Some German prisoners rejected the evidence. They devised elaborate explanations. The abundance was showmanship, they claimed. American production figures were propaganda fabrications. But most prisoners, confronted daily with material reality, reached a different conclusion. The Americans weren't lying. The abundance wasn't exceptional treatment. It was simply how America operated. The psychological impact was profound. These were soldiers who'd fought believing they served the world's most advanced industrial power. They'd been told German technical superiority would overcome any disadvantage, and much of that was genuine. German weapons were often technically superior. German training was rigorous. But none of that mattered when your ammunition ran out and your enemies didn't. Consider the specific impact on infantry soldiers who'd fought in North Africa. They calculated how many firefights they'd experienced with insufficient ammunition. They remembered companies that had to withdraw not from casualties but from empty magazines. They compared those experiences to reports of American units, sometimes discarding partially full ammunition boxes because carrying them was too heavy. The casual American abundance wasn't just superior, it was psychologically devastating. Artillery personnel particularly grasped the implications. German artillery doctrine emphasized ammunition conservation. Battery commanders calculated shells carefully. American artillery, by contrast, routinely expended thousands of shells in preparatory bombardments. They used artillery for psychological effect. For harassment purposes, German forces, ammunition constrained, reserved only for critical situations. German artillery expended an average of 2,941 tons per day in 1944, considered unsustainable. American artillery regularly exceeded those rates in secondary theaters. Tank crews had similar realizations. German armored doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. The Panther and Tiger tanks were genuinely formidable, superior in many respects to American armor. But that superiority required fuel, ammunition, spare parts that German logistics increasingly couldn't provide. American tanks carried ammunition loads German crews would have considered excessive. They were resupplied so readily that expending full loads wasn't consequential. The propaganda value of German prisoners' recognition wasn't lost on American authorities. By 1945, the United States implemented re-education programs at major camps. Prisoners attended lectures on democracy, watched American films, read selected materials. The programs had mixed results, but the material reality surrounding them provided more convincing evidence than any lecture. The educational opportunities represented another manifestation of American capacity. Almost every camp maintained libraries. Larger camps offered educational programs, English classes, mathematics, technical subjects, even university courses. The programs demonstrated a society confident enough to invest in educating enemy soldiers. For prisoners from Eastern territories, East Prussia, Silesia, areas now under Soviet control, repatriation posed existential questions. They had no Germany to return to. For these prisoners, American captivity represented relative safety. Some refused repatriation entirely. Georg Gärtner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, in September 1945 and remained free for 40 years. When he finally surrendered in 1985, the government couldn't prosecute him. He became an American citizen in 2009 at age 88. Thousands of German prisoners, returning to devastated Germany, remembered American abundance. Many immigrated legally to the United States. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually returned as immigrants, becoming citizens, business owners, community leaders. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The German prisoners who witnessed American abundance returned to Germany carrying knowledge propaganda couldn't convey. They'd seen a society that could fight a global war and maintain civilian prosperity. They'd experienced industrial capacity that treated 41 billion rounds as merely one component of production. Germany never knew America produced 41 billion rounds in 4 years because the scale was beyond their capacity to imagine. It wasn't until German prisoners arrived in America and confronted material reality that the truth became undeniable. The ammunition represented a productive system that could outperform European industry while maintaining higher living standards. It was proof that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources more effectively than fascist command economies. When Klaus Becker was eventually captured and sent to America, he learned what his 12 bullets represented. Not German efficiency or discipline. They represented an industrial base stretched to breaking, fighting an opponent that measured ammunition in billions per year. The mathematics were written not in tactics or courage, but in productive capacity, and by that measure, Germany never had a chance. This is their story, documented through military records, prisoner testimonies, and production figures. The Germans never knew, until they did, and by then, the war was already over. The revelation didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in moments of recognition that accumulated like drops of water filling a bucket until the weight became undeniable. For German prisoners scattered across America's heartland, each day brought new evidence of a productive capacity that seemed to defy the laws of economics they'd been taught. In the summer of 1944, a group of German prisoners working a wheat harvest in Kansas witnessed something that would haunt their understanding of the war. The farmer, a man named John Henderson, mentioned casually that his 2 sons were overseas, one in Italy, one in the Pacific. His workforce had been cut by 2/3, yet his farm, with prisoner labor and mechanical equipment, was producing more wheat than it had before the war. More wheat, with fewer workers, while simultaneously sending millions of tons of grain to feed Allied armies across 3 continents. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Werner Schmidt, did the mathematics. If one Kansas farm could increase production while losing most of its workforce, what did that suggest about American agricultural capacity overall? The answer was staggering. America was feeding itself, feeding substantial portions of Allied armies, feeding liberated populations in Europe, and maintaining strategic food reserves all simultaneously. The abundance wasn't temporary or unsustainable. It was simply how American agriculture functioned, the same pattern repeated across industries. At a lumber operation in Oregon, German prisoners watched American forestry equipment process timber at rates that would have required 10 times the workers in Germany. At a food processing plant in California, they observed canning operations that preserved more fruit in a single day than many German towns consumed in a month. At construction sites across the South and Southwest, they saw infrastructure projects, roads, buildings, water systems being built despite the war, not deferred until after it. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These were educated men, many of them. They understood industrial processes, logistics, economics. What they were witnessing shouldn't have been possible during total war. Every economic principle they'd learned suggested that military production required civilian sacrifice, that you couldn't simultaneously maximize war output and maintain peacetime investment. Yet America was doing exactly that. The ammunition production represented the clearest example. By late 1944, enough information had filtered through. Prisoner camps that educated prisoners could reconstruct approximate production figures. Lake City, 7 billion rounds annually. The Denver Ordnance Plant, similar capacity. The Twin Cities Ordnance Plant in Minnesota, billions more. The Evansville Chrysler Arsenal, 47 billion rounds of .45 caliber alone by war's end. The Street Louis Ordnance Plant. The Remington Facilities, Winchester, Federal, Western Cartridge Company. Even conservative estimates, assuming only the documented facilities operating at confirmed capacities, produced numbers exceeding 30 billion rounds. More aggressive calculations, accounting for smaller contractors and classified facilities, approached or exceeded the 41 billion figure that prisoners had initially dismissed as propaganda. The realization was crushing. Germany hadn't lost because of tactical failures or strategic blunders, though those existed. Germany had lost because the mathematics of industrial warfare made any other outcome impossible. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Richter, held at a camp in Texas, received a letter from his wife in Stuttgart in October 1944. She described conditions in Germany with careful language designed to pass censorship. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Reading between the lines, Richter understood that his family was surviving on roughly 1,000 calories per day. They had no coffee, real or ersatz, no chocolate, no meat except occasional rations. Soap was precious. Clothing was being mended and remended because no replacements existed. That evening, Richter went to the camp canteen and purchased, with his prisoner wages, a chocolate bar, a pack of American cigarettes, and real coffee. The cognitive dissonance became physical nausea. His family was starving in Germany, while he, a prisoner, ate better than he had before the war and could purchase luxuries his wife hadn't seen in years. The disparity wasn't just about industrial capacity, it was about two fundamentally different economic systems producing fundamentally different results. The letters from home told the story that official propaganda couldn't obscure. In early 1945, as Germany's situation deteriorated catastrophically, prisoners received increasingly desperate correspondence. Cities were being destroyed by bombing. Food rations were being cut again and again. Civilian mortality was rising. The eastern territories were being overrun by Soviet forces. The western territories faced advancing American, British, and Canadian armies. Every letter confirmed what prisoners in America already knew. Germany was being crushed not just militarily, but economically, demographically, industrially. Some prisoners responded by intensifying their resistance. If Germany was dying, they would remain defiant to the end. These men, often hardcore National Socialists, organized work slowdowns, attempted escapes, and, in extreme cases, murdered fellow prisoners deemed too cooperative with American authorities. The United States documented 14 such murders, though the actual number was likely higher. The violence reflected desperation, an attempt to maintain control and meaning in a situation where both were slipping away. But for most prisoners, the letters from home prompted different conclusions. They began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. If Germany was starving while prisoners in America ate well, what did that suggest about which system better served its people? If German civilians were dying in bombed cities while American civilians maintained relatively normal lives despite the war, what did that suggest about which nation had prepared more wisely? If German industry was collapsing from resource shortages while American industry was producing ammunition by the tens of billions, what did that suggest about which economic system was more robust? These weren't comfortable questions for men who'd fought believing in German superiority. They required acknowledging that much of what they'd been taught was false, that the sacrifices they'd made were ultimately pointless, that their nation had gambled on a war it couldn't win against an opponent whose strength it fundamentally misunderstood. The psychological weight of these realizations manifested in different ways. Depression was common, anger, resentment. Some prisoners withdrew into themselves, others became aggressively cooperative, as if by helping America they could somehow retroactively justify their captivity. A particularly telling incident occurred at Camp Concordia in Kansas in December 1944. A group of prisoners working a farm detail discovered that the farmer's son had been killed at the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, fighting against German forces. The prisoners expected hostility, possibly violence. Instead, the farmer continued treating them professionally, providing meals and payment as contracted. When one prisoner apologized for his son's death, The farmer responded with words that several prisoners recorded in diaries and letters. "War is madness. You didn't start it. You're just caught in it like my boy was." The response baffled the German prisoners. They'd been taught that Americans, as mongrel democratic weaklings, would lack the strength for such forgiveness. Yet here was a man who'd lost his son to German bullets treating German prisoners with basic human decency. The disconnect between propaganda and reality couldn't have been starker. This wasn't weakness. This was a different form of strength, rooted in principles that transcended national enmity. By early 1945, the war's end was clearly approaching. Germany's situation was hopeless. The question for prisoners wasn't whether Germany would lose, but what would happen afterward. The Yalta Conference in February had divided Europe into spheres of influence. Prisoners from eastern territories realized they had no homes to return to. East Prussia was being absorbed by the Soviet Union. Silesia was being given to Poland. Pomerania was being divided. Even prisoners from Western Germany faced grim prospects. Their cities were destroyed. Their economy was shattered. Their nation would be occupied, divided, controlled by the victors. Against this backdrop, America looked increasingly attractive, not just because of material abundance, though that mattered, but because of what that abundance represented: a society that could fight a global war without destroying itself, a system that could produce 41 billion rounds of ammunition while maintaining civilian prosperity. A nation that treated enemy prisoners better than many nations treated their own civilians. For prisoners weighing their futures, these weren't abstract considerations. They were practical calculations about where they could build lives after the war. The surrender in May 1945 brought these questions into sharp focus. Officially, prisoners should have been repatriated rapidly under Geneva Convention requirements, but American farmers and businesses had become dependent on prisoner labor. They lobbied for delays. The United States, facing labor shortages despite the war's end, agreed. German prisoners continued working through 1946, technically violating international law but serving practical American interests. For prisoners, the delay was often welcome. Conditions in occupied Germany were catastrophic. The winter of 1945 to 1946, remembered as the Hunger Winter, killed thousands of German civilians. Food rations in the British zone averaged between 1,000 and 1,500 calories daily. The American zone was slightly better but still inadequate. Infrastructure was destroyed. Housing was scarce. Employment was nearly impossible. Many prisoners, learning these facts through letters and military briefings, preferred American captivity to German freedom. The repatriation process, when it finally proceeded in earnest in 1946, was traumatic for many prisoners. They'd adapted to American abundance, American efficiency, American attitudes, returning to destroyed German cities, to economies that barely functioned, to populations that were starving and desperate, felt like stepping backward in time. Some prisoners, particularly younger ones, began planning almost immediately to return to America legally when circumstances permitted. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided the mechanism. It allowed immigration of Europeans displaced by the war, including Germans in certain categories. Former prisoners of war who'd behaved well in captivity, who'd learned English, who'd demonstrated work ethic and reliability, were often welcomed. American farmers who'd employed prisoners during the war sometimes sponsored their return. American businesses sought workers with German technical skills. American communities, particularly those with German-American populations, offered connections and support. The numbers tell part of the story. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners returned legally and became American citizens. But the broader impact was larger. Through the 1950s and 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Germans immigrated to America, many influenced directly or indirectly by prisoner experiences. They brought with them skills, work ethic, and memories of American abundance during a time when Germany was starving. They became engineers, businessmen, teachers, scientists. They raised families, built businesses, contributed to communities. Their success validated what they'd witnessed as prisoners. America offered opportunities that devastated Europe couldn't match. Some former prisoners achieved remarkable prominence. They became industrialists who helped rebuild German-American trade relations, diplomats who strengthened transatlantic cooperation, academics who taught new generations about American systems and values. Their contributions to post-war German reconstruction and to German-American friendship were substantial, though often unacknowledged because discussing prisoner-of-war experiences remained sensitive for decades. But beyond individual stories, the prisoner experience had broader implications. The men who'd witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand returned to Germany, understanding that the future lay not in militarism or autarky, but in international cooperation and market economics. They'd seen that democratic capitalism, whatever its flaws, could produce prosperity that command economies couldn't match. They'd experienced a society where abundance was normal, where waste was acceptable because resources were so plentiful that perfect efficiency wasn't necessary. This knowledge influenced how they approached post-war reconstruction. The Marshall Plan's success in Germany owed something to this foundation. Germans who'd witnessed American abundance as prisoners understood that American aid wasn't charity but investment, that American economic principles could generate prosperity, that cooperation with America served German interests. The economic miracle of 1950s West Germany reflected many factors, but among them was a generation of leaders and workers who'd learned, sometimes as prisoners, that American methods produced results. The ammunition, those 41 billion rounds, had been more than bullets. They'd been evidence of a system that could outproduce any rival while maintaining higher living standards than any command economy. They'd been proof that free markets, properly organized, could mobilize resources more efficiently than any centralized planning. They'd been demonstration that American power rested not on temporary advantages, but on fundamental economic strengths that would persist after the war. The German prisoners who counted bullets in foxholes, who witnessed abundance in Kansas wheat fields, who purchased chocolate in camp canteens while their families starved in Stuttgart, carried home knowledge that propaganda couldn't convey. They'd seen American power not as military force but as productive capacity. They'd learned that wars are won not just by soldiers but by factories, not just by tactics but by economics, not just by courage but by the ability to sustain production year after year, regardless of losses or setbacks. The 41 billion rounds told the story of two nations, two systems, two approaches to industrial warfare. One rationed bullets like precious gems. The other produced them by the billions and worried more about storage than supply. One fought desperately with diminishing resources. The other fought confidently with resources that seemed limitless. The outcome was never in doubt, not really, not once the numbers were understood. The German prisoners learned this truth, and in learning it, they began to understand what had truly defeated them. The final year of captivity, 1946, brought a peculiar kind of clarity to German prisoners still held in American camps. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, yet they remained in America, working farms, processing food, maintaining infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on them. They'd been captured fighting against America, yet here they were, sustained by American abundance while their families in Germany faced the worst winter of the entire war. Letters from home painted a portrait of suffering that exceeded anything experienced during the fighting. In Hamburg, civilians survived on daily rations that averaged 900 calories. In Berlin, people scavenged through rubble for anything burnable as fuel. In the Ruhr Valley, children showed signs of severe malnutrition that would affect their development permanently. The hunger winter of 1945–46 killed tens of thousands of Germans through starvation, exposure, and diseases that thrived in weakened populations. Prisoners in America, eating 2,500-calorie meals and sleeping in heated barracks, felt a guilt that transcended simple survivors' remorse. They were living better as prisoners than their families were as free people. One prisoner, Friedrich Weber, a former engineer from Dresden, kept a detailed diary that survived in family archives. His entry from January 19, 1946, is particularly revealing. Today we received our weekly ration of chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee from the canteen. Real coffee. I cannot remember the last time my wife mentioned coffee in her letters. Perhaps 1942? I purchased 4 chocolate bars with my wages. 4. While my children in Dresden survive on bread so coarse it barely qualifies as food, the Americans don't understand what they have. They cannot. If they did, they would guard it more carefully, treasure it more deeply. They simply assume abundance is normal. Perhaps for them, it is. Weber's observation captured something essential about the German prisoner experience. Americans didn't treat abundance as miraculous or exceptional. It was simply baseline expectation. Factories produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition, not because some heroic mobilization achieved the impossible, but because American industrial capacity made such production merely challenging rather than impossible. The casualness of American abundance was, in many ways, more impressive than the abundance itself. It suggested reserves of capability that hadn't even been fully tapped, potential that remained unrealized because it wasn't yet needed. This understanding grew stronger as prisoners learned more about American wartime production beyond ammunition. The Liberty ships that had transported them to America, 18,400, constructed during the war, at peak production, 1 completed every day. The aircraft, 300,000 military planes produced, compared to Germany's 113,000. The tanks, 88,000 American versus 25,000 German. The trucks, the jeeps, the artillery pieces, the naval vessels. Every category told the same story. American production exceeded German production by multiples, sometimes by orders of magnitude. But the most striking comparison wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative. German production had been achieved through total mobilization. Every resource, every factory, every worker had been directed toward the war effort. Civilian consumption had been slashed. Living standards had declined continuously from 1939 onward. By 1944, German civilians lived in conditions of severe deprivation, while the military consumed every resource the economy could produce. American production, by contrast, had been achieved while maintaining civilian consumption at levels that would have seemed luxurious to Germans. Americans faced rationing, certainly, gasoline, rubber, certain foods, consumer goods. But the rationing was comparative to American abundance, not to actual scarcity. Americans complained about rationing while eating better than most Europeans had eaten before the war. American civilians grumbled about restrictions while living in conditions that German prisoners envied. The disparity revealed something about the two systems' fundamental efficiency. One produced less while sacrificing everything, the other produced vastly more while maintaining prosperity. The educational programs at major camps intensified in 1946, as American authorities recognized that repatriation was approaching. The programs, officially called re-education, though prisoners often called them propaganda, aimed to prepare prisoners for democratic participation in occupied Germany. Prisoners attended lectures on American government, watched films about American history, read materials explaining market economics and democratic principles. The programs had mixed effectiveness. Many prisoners resented what they viewed as crude indoctrination, but the lectures were less persuasive than the surrounding evidence. A prisoner named Otto Hartmann, attending lectures at Fort Eustis, Virginia, later recalled, "The American officer lectured us about democracy, about freedom, about the superiority of American values. We sat there in comfortable chairs, in a heated room, having eaten a full breakfast, wearing clean clothes, with access to a library of thousands of books. Meanwhile, our families in Germany froze and starved under American occupation. The irony was painful. Yet the officer wasn't wrong. We were prisoners living better than free Germans. What did that tell us about American power? Not military power that was obvious, but economic power, organizational power, the power to produce abundance even while fighting a global war. That was the real lesson, though I doubt the officer realized he was teaching it." The screening programs at Fort Eustis and other major camps divided prisoners into categories based on their political attitudes. White classifications went to anti-Nazis, grey to politically neutral prisoners, black to committed National Socialists. The categories determined how quickly prisoners would be repatriated and whether they'd face additional forced labour in Britain or France. The system was imperfect. Prisoners traded classifications, corrupted the process, exploited loopholes, but it reflected American recognition that German prisoners weren't monolithic, that treating them individually rather than collectively served American interests. For prisoners classified as black committed Nazis, the repatriation process included additional penalties. Many were sent to Britain or France for 2 to 3 years of forced labour before final repatriation to Germany. The practice was legally questionable under Geneva Convention provisions, but the Allies implemented it anyway. The experience was often harsh. British and French civilians, having suffered under German occupation, treated German prisoners far less generously than Americans had. Food was scarce, work was hard, conditions were deliberately punitive. Prisoners who'd experienced American captivity and then British or French labour camps understood viscerally the difference between the three Allied powers' approaches. The final repatriations, occurring throughout 1946 and into 1947, marked endings and beginnings. Prisoners boarded ships returning to a Germany they barely recognized. The cities they remembered were rubble. The economy they'd known had collapsed. The government they'd served had been dissolved and replaced with Allied occupation authorities. For many, especially younger prisoners, the question wasn't whether Germany would recover, but whether they wanted to be part of that recovery or seek opportunities elsewhere. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided answers. It opened immigration pathways for Europeans displaced by the war, including Germans in certain categories. Former prisoners who'd behaved well, who'd learned English, who'd demonstrated work ethic, found American sponsors willing to facilitate their return. Farmers who'd employed prisoners during the war sometimes offered permanent positions. Businesses sought workers with German technical skills. Communities, particularly those with German-American populations, welcomed immigrants with shared cultural backgrounds. The return wasn't easy. Former prisoners faced suspicion from some Americans who questioned whether enemy soldiers should be allowed to immigrate. They faced challenges adapting to civilian life in a foreign country. They dealt with guilt about leaving Germany during Reconstruction. But they also found opportunities that devastated Germany couldn't offer. They could work, earn, save, build lives. They could raise families in peace and prosperity. They could become Americans in ways that the prisoner experience had, paradoxically, prepared them for. The numbers tell part of the story. 5,000 former prisoners returned as immigrants and became citizens, but hundreds of thousands more Germans, influenced directly or indirectly by prisoner experiences, immigrated through the 1950s and 60s. They brought skills, work ethic, and appreciation for American abundance. They built businesses, joined professions, contributed to communities. Their children became doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers. Their grandchildren became indistinguishable from other Americans, the prisoner of war heritage, a family story, rather than a defining identity. Some former prisoners achieved remarkable success. They became industrial leaders in German-American trade, diplomats strengthening transatlantic relations, academics teaching about American systems, scientists contributing to research. Their prominence validated what they'd witnessed as prisoners. American society offered opportunities for advancement based on merit, not birth or connections. The meritocracy wasn't perfect. Prejudice existed. Barriers remained, but compared to the rigid class structures of pre-war Germany, America seemed refreshingly open. But the broader historical impact extended beyond individual success stories. The generation of Germans who'd witnessed American abundance as prisoners helped shape post-war German attitudes toward America and toward economic systems generally. They understood that American power rested not on temporary advantages, but on fundamental economic strengths. They'd seen that market economies could outproduce command economies, that democratic societies could mobilize more effectively than dictatorships, that prosperity and freedom were compatible rather than contradictory. This knowledge influenced the Marshall Plan's reception in Billetes Reunites Cause, Germany. When America offered economic aid for European reconstruction, Germans who'd witnessed American abundance understood the offer differently than Europeans without that experience. They knew American aid wasn't charity but investment. They understood that American economic principles could generate prosperity. They recognized that cooperation with America served German interests. The economic miracle of 1950s West Germany reflected many factors, but among them was leadership informed by men who'd learned American methods, sometimes as prisoners. The contrast with East Germany was instructive. The Soviet occupation zone implemented command economy principles similar to those Germany had used during the war. Central planning, resource allocation by bureaucracy, production targets set politically rather than by market demand. The results were predictably similar to wartime Germany: chronic shortages, inefficiency, declining living standards. East Germans, living under the system, could compare their conditions to West Germany's prosperity and draw conclusions. The Berlin Wall, constructed in 1961, was necessary precisely because East Germans voted with their feet, fleeing to the West in numbers that threatened the East German state's viability. The ammunition, those 41 billion rounds, had been more than statistics. They'd been evidence that transformed understanding. German prisoners who'd counted bullets as precious in foxholes, who'd witnessed American abundance in Kansas wheat fields, who'd purchased chocolate in camp canteens while families starved in Stuttgart, returned home carrying knowledge that propaganda couldn't convey. They'd seen American power as productive capacity rather than military force. They'd learned that wars are won by factories as much as by soldiers, by economics as much as by tactics, by the ability to sustain production year after year regardless of losses. The final irony was that German prisoners had been correct about one thing. American soldiers did think ammunition grew on trees, not because Americans were stupid or wasteful, though some waste occurred, but because American industrial capacity made ammunition so abundant that careful conservation became less important than overwhelming firepower. German soldiers conserved bullets because scarcity forced conservation. American soldiers expended bullets liberally because abundance permitted liberality. The two approaches reflected two fundamentally different economic realities. Klaus Becker, the Unteroffizier who'd counted 12 bullets in a Norman foxhole, was captured in August 1944 and sent to a camp in Nebraska. He worked farm details through 1945 and 1946, returned to Germany in 1947, and immigrated legally to America in 1952. He became a machinist in Wisconsin, raised 3 children, retired in 1979, and died in 1998. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, his prisoner of war experience not at all. But in family stories, preserved by grandchildren, Becker reportedly said that being captured was the luckiest day of his life. Not because it saved him from combat, though it did, but because it opened his eyes to what prosperity actually meant. The 41 billion rounds represented not just American industrial capacity, but American confidence, the confidence to produce abundantly rather than conserve desperately, the confidence to maintain civilian prosperity while fighting total war, the confidence to invest in the future while securing the present, the confidence to treat enemy prisoners humanely because doing so served long-term interests, the confidence to rebuild former enemies because creating prosperity was better than maintaining poverty. German prisoners learned these lessons not through lectures but through experience. They lived them daily. They ate American abundance, worked with American equipment, witnessed American efficiency, experienced American generosity. Some remained bitter, viewing American power as unfair advantage. Some remained loyal to Germany, returning home determined to rebuild. But many, perhaps most, recognized that they'd witnessed something historically significant, a nation that had revolutionized industrial warfare by producing munitions at scales previously unimaginable, while simultaneously maintaining prosperity that commanded economies couldn't achieve. The Germans never knew America produced 41 billion rounds in 4 years, because the number exceeded their capacity to imagine. But the prisoners learned. They counted the bullets, witnessed the abundance, experienced the reality, and in learning, They understood what had truly defeated Germany. Not tactical failures or strategic blunders, though those existed, not insufficient courage or inadequate skill, though gaps appeared, but mathematics, the simple, undeniable mathematics of industrial capacity. America could produce 41 billion rounds because American economic systems made such production merely difficult rather than impossible. Germany couldn't match that production because German systems made it impossible regardless of effort. The war was over before it began, decided by factory capacity rather than battlefield courage. The prisoners learned this truth. And in learning it, they began their transformation from enemies to immigrants, from soldiers to citizens, from believers in German superiority to witnesses of American abundance. This is their story, documented and verified. The Germans never knew, until they did. And by then, the war was over, but their new lives were just beginning.